All right, we are now moving on to motion tracking, which will use the Mocha engine, which a sort of small version of the Mocha plugin is included in After Effects, factory issue After Effects. I think there are some pro level things you can buy. I think you can still buy advanced capabilities. But the core things are here. And there are a lot of plugins that Mocha has licensed its code to. So even if you're not choosing to edit in Premiere, you might want to work in Final Cut or something like that. There are third-party plugins that will do some motion tracking stuff like we're going to do. What we have here is two elements, a city looking straight down on New York Central Park, the edge of the city and the park. And then I've got a Star Destroyer hovering over this city, casting a bit of a shadow down onto the buildings below. And then just to be fancy, I've got it sort of pivoting. But the pivot is not a motion track. The motion track is the fact that this is moving down. It's as if the camera recording this or drone or whatever is flying up, or forward in this case, looking straight down. And the ship is tied to that location on the ground to a certain degree. We're letting it pivot, but it was just to make it look prettier. The key is it's anchored to the ground, so the two appear to be moving, and it's a much more believable comp when you look at it that way. All right, so to do this, we will need the elements that we brought in for this week's exercise. And we will want to go to the tracking subfolder of the week 12 media that I shared. And we are going to bring in the NY top-down, New York top-down, and the top two as in number 2 JPEG. All right, so I'm going to make a new comp, but we are bringing in those two elements, NY top-down, which is an MP4, and top2.jpg. All right, so I'm going to go composition, new composition. 1920 1080. We set the last one for 30. I don't really like 30. We're going to go to 23976. It's not really going to matter, but I'm just going to do that. And then I'm going to say ship over park, just so that I know what it is. And I'm going to hit OK. Black background's fine. Nothing else we have to change. I do not know why I can't scale this. It's really annoying. Okay, so we're going to start with our two layers, right? Well, as you can guess, we're going to put the park first. So New York top-down is our background. And one of the first things you may notice, if your screen is set to fit so that it's fitting the comp into this window, is that this image is not 16 by 9. It's actually a little bit off, and so there is a black margin at the top and bottom. Let's fix that. So I'm going to open S for scale on this layer. So I clicked the letter S after touching this layer. Scale controls came up, and I'm going to put in like 108, which is about right. So chances are that footage was probably shot in like 4K cinema, which is a different proportion than standard 4K shape video, like 16 by 9. So there are some variances. Just know that they exist and that you may need to compensate for them in here. And you could also argue that if this footage is 1920 1080, which it's not, it's 1920 1012, you might have to lose a little resolution to make this scale adjustment, which sucks. Now, if it really was 4K and it had more than enough, it was just shaped wrong, you maybe wouldn't lose anything. But just be aware, not all images are going to come into you exactly 16 by 9 ready to work with standard. 4K has muddied that water. We had standard def dimensions defined for years, and by the time 4K came along, they couldn't just make it exactly 1920 1080 proportions or 16 by 9. They went with something else. So much fun. All right, so anyway, we fixed it. It fills the frame. Life is good. Let's go get our ship, which is the top 2 JPEG. I'm going to drop it down there, put it on the top layer because I want it in front, and then we notice a couple things right away. First of all, it's too big, right? So we need to scale this bad boy down because it's actually a JPEG. It's a still image, and it's larger resolution, if you will, than HD video. So we can go to the scale and we can downscale it a little bit. I am going to say let's allow a little bit of room on the front and back. So 70% works pretty well for me. Okay. So we scaled it down 70% so we'd have some margin on either side, not just from the black, because we're going to get rid of the black, but from the tip not being running off the frame and the jets in the back not running off the frame. So we scaled it down, but now we have to do what I've said many times the graphics people tell me is a way of life, and that is we got to mask around this thing. So let's go get our pen tool, which is also the letter G on your keyboard. And I am going to go ahead and zoom in a bit so that I can see what I'm doing. I'm going to go 100%, which is pretty big for me because my screen res is set smaller for sharing. And I'm going to start drawing. All right, make sure you only create one mask as you're doing this. So if you notice as I'm drawing, it's pink. If for some reason I screw up and I end up creating a second mask, it tries to tell you that that has happened by changing the color of the mask lines from being pink to being something else, and then I know I screwed something up. And it will be a separate one. And if you actually look at the masks as you're drawing them down here, it shows you this mask is pink. So if this is open, like I just opened it, if you accidentally start a second one, it'll have a mask too, and then you will have screwed yourself. So you would have to undo until life was good again. So I am not being perfect about this. I'm just trying to get it close, but I'm trying to give it a little bit of texture detail because that'll make it look even prettier. Just work your way around the ship. I'm going to ignore that little nubbin just like I did back here. And I'm holding down spacebar to move my image around when I need to. All right. This is where we whistle while we work. Those nubbins are hardly visible down here because they're in the shadows. But I don't feel like taking the time to get it right. And to be honest, I don't want you guys to obsess either, right? Because the point of this is a classroom exercise. When you start working on things like your final, then I'm going to very much care about whether it looks like you did a hack job or you actually tried to make it look good. So you don't have to make it perfect now because our goal is just to keep moving. But I don't want to make it sound like it never matters. It does matter as time goes on and the nature of what you're working on changes. It will matter very much. Now remember, as long as you're on the pen tool, it's kind of dangerous touching on these things. So once I feel like I've drawn my shape, I like to just sort of get back to the arrow tool, which is the letter V. Then if I don't like where a point is, I can still move it around. It's not going to try to start a new mask or do anything weird. But that looks pretty good. Again, it's a mask. I can go down to the mask controls and I can say, hey, let's feather just the edge of that just a smidge, just like a few pixels, 4 or 5 pixels, just to soften it up. And then, of course, mask expansion generally is not what you want. It's usually about taking it in the reverse, which is choking it back a little bit so that it's a little more guaranteed that there's no black showing. And of course, as long as the mask is highlighted, you keep seeing your pink dots and you can't really judge until you click on nothing. So I'm going to click on nothing to let them go away. And I'm going to look at it. I'm going to go, hey, that's pretty good. I think if anything, my feathering is a little strong because it's giving it too soft of a look. So I'm going to change it to like 2. Click off. It's a little better. Kind of just looks like normal aliasing that would happen in real life at that point. So pretty cool. Now, assuming that you're ready to move on, the next thing I'm going to pay attention to is we need to pick a section of this footage that we're going to anchor our stuff to. So we don't have to pick it right this minute, but I think it's a good time to start thinking about it. And so basically we're going to have to pick a contrasty part of this image over where the buildings are, would be my recommendation, because there's more texture over there than the sort of amorphousness of trees. And you want to make sure that that you're only choosing from things that are up the whole time. All right, so I didn't do this yet, but I would like to bracket off my workspace. So now that I've sort of found the last frame of the background, I'm going to hit the letter N on the keyboard. So now my bracket ends there and I don't have to see it drop off to nothing, to the ship over nothing. Close enough. But the point is, we don't want to pick, if I'm at the front of my footage and I say, oh, I want to anchor to this little point down here. All right. This is not a good point to focus on, because what's going to happen is, as the footage plays out, it will leave the frame, and that's going to create a problem. I want to pick something that I know is going to be up the whole time. So since the stuff is all moving down, I'm going to want to pick something up here. Now the ship is in my way. We want to actually get into Mulca to make this decision, but like I said, I kind of like to sort of judge early on, what do I think I'm going to anchor this to? So I need to anchor with something up here. Maybe even something that's hidden by the ship. It doesn't have to be. The reality is you can offset your anchor point by quite a bit and it will still work. Meaning if you're tracking like this blue section up here, as long as it never leaves the frame, you can still have the ship follow it, but not necessarily be touching it. All right, so you can get that tricky if you want to. But again, for our sake, I want you to start thinking about your image as what is moving and what do I want to, what's the illusion I want to create. All right, so we have to now track it using Mulca, and we want to track the background, which is our lower layer here, the NY top down. So if I click on that one time just to make sure that it's highlighted, I can then go up to the animation pull down menu. And if you'll notice, about 2/3 of the way down, we have Track in Boris Effects Mulca. Yes, please. That's what we want. Track in Boris Effects Mulca. Now, nothing's really happened. All it's done is add the plugin to it as an effect. And you'll notice that there's not a lot of controls here. They are mostly hidden underneath here. There's a matte control section and a tracking data section. We are going to come back to the tracking data one. We won't need the matte one for this exercise, but you can uncollapse this. But here's the thing. We actually have to launch this plugin as its own freestanding little bit of code, and before we set any of this stuff. So to do that, we're going to double click on the Mulca logo. And when you do that, it will open a new window that is the Boris Effects Mulca interface. It usually is trying to sell you more stuff, although this is a free plugin, so maybe I'm not being fair. That's kind of cool. The lighting thing, nice. And it's free? Yeah, I may have to go back and pull that down later. But anyway, we can tell it not to show again. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to say close. And then there's this little welcome screen, little splash screen, and there's a manual you can launch if you're totally clueless. That's not a bad thing. But we're just going to go to start so that now we get this window up. Now mine, I've already scaled up. Yours probably opened and was probably more like this. I would encourage you to grab the corner and make it bigger so you can see what you're doing. All right. Now, this Mulca plugin has been updated a few times in the last year or two. So I've already noticed that, oh, if you open it in 2019, it's a little different. If you open it in the 2018 version, it's definitely different. This is the 2020, the most current version that I'm using as of today. But just know that it could look a little different, but I think most of the features that I'm going to point you to are still applicable. These are still things that are around. They just may not be laid out exactly like I say they are. I've already had a little bit of discrepancy with that. But basically what we have here is our footage has been opened. We have the ability, again, to just shuttle around at the bottom and, again, ensure that you're not picking something that is going to end up out of the frame. Now, our goal is to pick a region of the screen that is as contrasty as possible and hopefully isn't doing any jiggling or moving around in ways that could throw it off. So the first thing that jumps out at me, if I'm sort of looking at what is the most contrasty, is probably this one rooftop here that is really easy to see. It's very white, considering how dark some of the others are. This is very white, and there's a nice dark chunk of road here next to it that allows this to be a pretty contrasty part of the screen. And it never leaves the frame. So I'm on the last frame here. It's already at the bottom, but it's not gone. And again, if I go back, it hasn't had time to be off screen yet. So that's a pretty good chunk. I'm going to gamble that that's probably one of the better areas to choose. All right. So there's several different ways to select things. I'm going to show you the most elementary, easiest way to think about. but that doesn't mean there isn't more wisdom out there for choosing these better. But I've had pretty good luck by basically just grabbing this tool up here that looks like a inkwell pen tool. It is right here. All right. That's the tool we want. It looks like a little inkwell with an X on the back. That is, if you sit with your cursor over it for a second, it says create X spline layer tool. It also has the command L command to bring it up. And we are going to draw a box around this by setting 4 points. Okay, it'll let you set more than 4 points, but we're going to take the 5th point and just click back on the first point again. So what do I mean by that? I mean you're going to go 1, and then 2, and then 3, and then 4, and then since it wants to make another one and I don't need another one, I'm going to click back on the first one, and now it is a box. It has closed itself in. All right. That's what I want. So you're basically saying, see this region? Keep track of what's going on in this region of the screen when I start the tracking process. All right. Now, when it tracks, it can keep track of several things. The transform controls, which we have seen over and over again in After Effects, those are basically X and Y coordinates. Scaling, which we know what that is, right? Zooming and all that, essentially creating the illusion of a zoom. Rotation, skew, which is whether it's warping at all, and then true warping based on 3D space, which is perspective. The more of these boxes that you have on, the slower your motion tracking process is going to be. All right. That's not necessarily bad. If you're doing really elaborate motion tracking, you need them all on. Be glad they're there. But for this particular move that we're tracking, I can tell you from my own experience that by leaving all of these boxes on, it tries too hard and it actually does a poor job of figuring out what's going on this very simple, straightforward top to bottom move that this camera is doing. So I'm actually going to say let's leave perspective off. It already was off. I don't care about skew either. There's nothing like that happening. There's no rotation happening. And there really isn't even any scaling happening. All it's really happening is that it's moving at a set rate from top to bottom, left to right in order to be a smooth move. So I'm saving myself time and arguably things that can go wrong by turning off as many of these as you don't think you need. Once you have, in fact, chosen these, then you're ready to track. The only thing that I would have you check is make sure that while you were clicking around, you didn't end up at a different part in your timeline than the beginning. Now, if this item left the frame or was closer and easier to see at the end of your clip, you can track and reverse. We did that or talked about doing that when we blurred license plates in Premiere. Okay, so there is nothing wrong with tracking in reverse. The point is it's going to be easier on you if you at least start at the beginning or the end as opposed to somewhere in the beginning. And in this case, you're going to be fine at the beginning. So let's go to the beginning. We've got just transform selected, and we're going to go to this button right here that says track. It looks like a little play button, and when you click it, it's going to take a second or two to analyze, and then it will start looking at every frame and it will start figuring out what's happening as the thing plays. So it doesn't move right away. Don't panic. Don't click it again. Just sit for a second, let it do its thing. And now mine is chugging along. And there's 200 and some frames in this clip. So it should go pretty fast, especially since we turned off so many of these tracking features. But results may vary. Everybody's computer's, different. And mine is using my GPU. I happen to have a display up here. It shows all the individual cores in my internal processor, and they're like barely moving. But my GPU is clocking in at about 45, almost half its power is being devoted to doing this. So that's kind of cool to know. But just know that those are things, if you start talking about getting systems or purchasing computers, my GPU is matched well with After Effects and Mocha, and so it does outsource essentially all the heavy lifting to the GPU. Now, mine's almost done, but I want to clarify one more point. When it generates these things, apparently there's the ability to link to different tracks. I don't completely understand yet how to use that, but later it's going to ask us what track should we pull the information from, and by default, it goes to layer 1. I don't even see there's none or layer 1. So I want you to just see this so that when it pops up later, you're not going, what the heck is that? It's just referencing this. And if you in fact did some other selections here, you might need to remember which layer you put it on. But we're doing an elementary one, so it's not going to be too terribly tricky. So once you've got it, and you should be able to shuttle around and actually see the box move with that rooftop. Now, it has another way of looking at this thing that you've tracked, because it's kind of hard to see the little wireframe edges and see if it's actually done a good job. You can actually go up to this pink box, show planar grid, planar as in a flat plane. You can turn that on, and then it will actually show you what the surface of this, if you were to track something onto it, would move like. So if you hit play, you can get a sense of how it moves. And I think you can make it, nope, I don't want to do that. Never mind. Don't listen to me. But yes, so that is a nice way to sort of confirm, yeah, that's pretty smooth. That looks like a board attached to the top of this rooftop. It's moving correctly. You'll notice when you use the play buttons down here, it goes to the end and then it plays back in full normal speed in reverse. And it will keep bouncing back and forth. So it gets to the beginning of the clip, reverses direction, and starts playing forward again. So that's just something to be aware of. It's not done anything wrong. It's just what it's trying to do to help you. All right. So that looks pretty good. What do we do now? Well, what we do now is we save this project. So this is a separate little app that has opened and is running, the Mocha app. So we're going to save it. Now you don't have to pick where to save it to. You just got to hit the save button up in the top left-hand corner of the interface. All right. So it feels a little counterintuitive for us old school people that are used to going, well, if I'm saving, I should get to make a decision as to where it saves. You're basically saying, remember the information you just created, is essentially what you just did by hitting save. So you can now close this window because that information is now saved. And we are going to bring it in to the plugin itself, but we need to set a couple things. First, we need to tell it where we're going to be exporting all this information to. Now, what is this information? What motion tracking is basically doing for you is it's creating keyframes for you that will make your thing move exactly the way it's supposed to move. The alternative would be to set all these keyframes yourself. So it has tracking data that it's going to pull in. We need to tell it where to put it. So the first thing we have to say is actually export option. Is this a corner pin effect or a transform effect? Corner pin, this is a transform effect, so select transform. A corner pin replicates the physics of the real world by saying, oh, I want to track something on my phone, and I had an image up on my phone when I shot it with a dot or an X in every corner of the screen. And I just want to take another image, anchor those corners to the same place so that no matter where the phone moves and how it swivels, it stays attached to it. So it knows better how to replicate the physics by doing a corner pin. We're not going to do corner pin here, but you will hear that occasionally. People will say, well, I tried a normal motion track. It was okay, but when I corner pinned it, it was much better. Okay, so it figures out where those points have to go based on the fact that it's changing perspective. All right, but we're transforming. That's the nature of this effect that we're doing, so we just need to set this to transform. Next, export the layer to something. To what? Well, right now, you would think we would want to do it to the ship. And you can do that, but we're not going to do it that way. And you will see a good reason. I'm going to demonstrate one good reason why we don't want to do that here in a minute. What we would rather do, and what keeps our option open here for being able to trick out a custom effect, is using a null. Okay, let's use a null. Okay, so in our comp, we're going to click down here. We're going to go up to layer, and we're going to go new null object. All right, so I now have a null that I can actually take all these keyframes and apply to. And then I could just link the ship to the null and it will move the way I want it to. Okay, so When I created that null, my little effects control went empty because there's no effects on the null yet. So I'm going to go back now to that lower level, that bottom layer where all my controls are. And now when I go layer export to, I have a place to put it, the null. All right. Now, before we can apply the export, we have to turn all that tracking data that it created into keyframes. So I'm going to go back up to the tracking data uh, top of this section here, and I'm actually going to click on the create tracking data button. All right, so click on that. And here is why I pointed out that interface thing before. It's saying, what layer in the original Mocha plugin did you put this information on? And the answer is layer 1. We never made that choice. There are no other choices, but this is confusing if you don't at least notice that that was up before. So yes, layer 1 is perfectly fine. And now we're telling it this should be a transform type control, and I want to apply it to the null that I created. Yours is probably not called null 8. It's just I have 8 of them already in my project, or 7 of them, so it named it the 8th one. And then once all these are set right, you can say apply the export. And when you do that, nothing appears to change. Well, guess what? If you go down to your null, if you remember, we can hit the letter U on the keyboard and it will show us all keyframes that have been applied to this layer. There were none until we hit that button before that applied it to this. And when you hit U, you will see that there is a boatload of position keyframes, scaling keyframes, and rotation keyframes that have been applied to this null. And it did it all for you. Life is good. The only thing is, our ship isn't moving, right? Well, that's because we haven't attached it to that null yet. And we all know how to do that, right? We're going to go to the little curly Q. We're going to draw from the curly Q up to the null layer. And now when you drag your image, you will notice that the ship is now anchored to that background, and the two will move in sync with one another, creating the illusion that these things are happening in real life. Pretty cool. Does anyone have any problems, or did that work for you? Raise your hand if you're having a problem, or unmute yourself and ask the question.
Uh, so when I hit apply export, it gave me an error and it said that the layer cannot be null, and then my program crashed.
Neat. That's just wonderfully annoying. Yeah, well, if it, especially since it crashed, I think your only option is to maybe try to build it again. Um, which you're going to do one for this week's assignment. So if you don't want to have to do this particular one again, that's fine with me, but that's like the last step. So it seems kind of crazy to like have you have to catch up if you don't want. But that's all you do. You know how to link to the null once it's there, right? We've done that several times. But maybe your autosave, if you didn't manually save at some point, maybe your autosave fired at one point, and maybe you can pick up at a point that's not completely starting over. But yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. I've not had that happen. I've had very good luck with this. The Tuesday class did have some people whose computers really struggled with running Molka. Um, so if you end up not getting your it to ever work, then shoot me an email and we'll work something out. I have a plan B for you. All right. But I'm sorry you had that happen. Now, if we go back and we look at my original, one of the things I pointed out was A, I have a pivot happening here, but B, I have a shadow from the ship that is being cast down onto the buildings. That is not terribly hard to make. All right. But I need to do, I need to create that shadow. And I need to create that shadow using a solid. All right. So let's do that because I want to show you why, again, using the null is so helpful. All right. So we have this wonderful, ship that we already cut out. And what we want to do is we want to create a solid that looks just like the ship. So a couple things have to happen. First, we have to make the solid. So let's go up to the layer and do new solid. Let's go ahead and leave it black if it's not already. and then we can hit OK. Now here's the thing. The solid that you probably just created is the wrong size because it probably set the solid to your comp size. And our comp size is 1920 1080. If you remember, our ship, when we first brought it in, our ship was too big and we had to scale it down. So how big was the ship? Well, I'm going to go back to my project tab and I'm going to go to top two, which is the name of my ship layer and or ship file, and it is 2560 by 1600. All right. So that means if we're going to steal this little cutout that we already did, then it needs to be cutting out from an element that is that size. So in a sense, if we cut out something this big from a 1920 1080 element, it's not going to have all the image and it's not going to be a solid, right? This is like a template. We're going to steal this mask and we're going to apply it to a solid, but the solid has to be the same size as the original element that we masked. That is what I'm trying to say in a very long-winded way. So there's nothing wrong with the fact that we already made a solid if it was the wrong size, because you can select it and you can go back up and you can open under the layer menu solid settings, and then this will come back up. Now mine remembers the last time I did this demo and it actually set it to the right size. Yours probably is not set right. But because I went back over here, what you need to do is look at the 2560 by 1600 dimensions of the item that we're going to steal the mask from and match them with your solid size. So this one should also be 2560 and by 1600. Okay, so make sure that your solid is set to that size and hit OK. Let's put it in the right position. I don't want my solid on top of everything. I want it between the ship and the background, right? So when I do that, now I've got a ship on the black solid. But if I open or uncollapse the controls for my ship, I can go in and find mask 1, which is the mask I already made, and I can do on a PC Control C, on a Mac Command C to copy it, and then I can go to my solid layer and I can paste it on a Mac Command V, on a PC Control V, and boom, there is the shape of my ship. Now, what did we also do to the ship layer? We matched the size now with our solid, but if you remember, the ship was so big we had to scale it down. We can go back to the ship, we can eyeball it, or we can go back to the ship, go to the scale controls and go, oh, it was at 70. So I want to match that on my solid. So if you go to the transform controls and you go to scale for your shadow, you can take it down or type in 70 and that should match it with the ship. Pretty cool. Now, the next thing I may want to do is move it down. I'm believing based on the lighting of this image that the sun is sort of on the top of the frame, which should cast a shadow underneath the ship, literally at the lower part of this frame. So I'm going to go to the Y controls of my solid, and I'm going to take the position and I'm going to drag it over just to offset it a little bit, and that's not bad. The only problem is it's way too dark, way too solid, right? Well, let's go into our mask controls and let's fix that. So I have the same mask. It was already cut. I didn't have to do it twice, which is glorious. Now I can go into the feathering and I can crank up the feathering and give it a nice sort of haze sort of shadow to it. I could play with opacity if it's still too dark, whatever. There's all kinds of stuff, but we're just basically we cheated off the layer to make a mask of the same thing. Pretty cool. Now, the only thing is when you play it, the shadow doesn't move. Well, that bites. I want it to move, right? I want it to maintain the distance and direction of the ship. Well, guess what? That's part of why we did it, all of our moving on the null. I can grab the little curlicue for my solid, point it at the null, and now when I move, the shadow moves with it. I couldn't have done that if I had anchored everything on something other than a null. So this gives us that ability to cheat, which is pretty cool. Now, the other thing I did in my little animation is I have the ship sort of rotating because to me, this is kind of boring looking, right? It doesn't move. I want to add a little more drama to it. So I'm going to go to the null controls, and I'm going to go to rotation, where I actually don't have anything happening. There's keyframes set there, but I don't have any rotation happening. So I can actually say, you know what, let's highlight all of these keyframes, all of them, and delete them. I hit the backspace key, and you'll notice my move and everything is perfectly fine because there really wasn't any rotation happening. I can go to the beginning of my timeline where the ship is sitting up there, and I can mark a keyframe. I can go to the end of my animation, and I can mark another keyframe manually, and I can pivot it just a little, just so there's a little drama. And now, not only does it move, but it pivots. And because I'm rotating the null, then the shadow moves as well with it.
What was the first step you did? You deleted some keyframes?
Yes, it even though I did in Mulka, I said only give me transform controls and I told it to leave rotation and scale alone. It didn't follow those direction. It gave me all things related to transformative controls. So these keyframes under rotation were doing nothing. So I just highlighted them all and nuked them all and then put my new rotation information in there, which is all I really needed for it to do a little pivot.
Right. Thank you.
All right. So it's kind of cool, cool, easy way to sort of cheat. But yeah, it's weird because we deliberately turned that off. But it didn't matter. It kept track of it all. It just set them all at 0 and nothing really changed. So I got rid of them so that I could create my own sort of rotate control. All right. And that gives you a much more believable look. All right. So again, the point of the shadow and all of that is to clarify look by putting the tracking information on a null layer. You basically open up the possibility of anchoring other things to the thing you went to so much trouble to anchor. So instead of applying it to the original ship, I actually made it its own thing. And I might even, like, maybe I don't want to call this null, or I call it, null. If we click on the title and hit return, I maybe call it null track. So I just know that is my tracking null. Maybe I have another null that's doing a hand drifting, handheld look to it or whatever that applies to all of this. But the point is, name it. I love the fact that it shows up as its own thing over here. My black solid is a name that is confusing. I might just call it ship shadow. Stay organized and your life will be much easier. Okay. That is the general idea of motion tracking. You go in, you have to tell it what track, you apply the effect, which is actually an item that comes out of the animation menu. It's not a plugin we go over and get in effects. It's actually in the animation logo, the track Boris thing. It's grayed out right now because I'm clicking on the wrong thing. But if I clicked on anything that would allow it, then it comes up. Here's track and Boris Mocha. Yep, you open the plugin, you do the tracking, you be selective about it, you save it, you leave, you come out, you deal with the effects control panel, and you say basically before you create anything, these are the places I'm going to want to put it, and then you apply it, and then you can play with the export and get it to work. All right. Any questions that should go on record before I stop recording? Then I'm going to stop. Good luck with that.